Welcome to this talk on bionics. My name is Dario Farina, and I'm not actually the bionic man of the title, but nonetheless, I hope I will capture your interest in discussing about technologies for integrating robotic parts into the human body. So the focus of this talk is neurotechnologies. And to give a very broad and general introduction to these technologies, I will tell you that these are the technologies related to connecting with the nervous system of humans in order to control external devices that could be, for example, robotic limbs or exoskeletons in order to support impaired functions, impaired cognitive or motor functions. And from the scientific point of view, we can summarize this field of research in a rather simple way. And the two schematic pictures that you have in this slide summarizes this field quite well. So on the left, you have a network of neural cells. And on the right, you have a biomechanical modeling of our complex movements. When we talk about neurotechnologies, what we are trying to do is to understand how the behavior of neural cells determine complex movements. Because if we can understand that, then we will also be able to substitute impaired body parts in patients by interfacing with their nervous system. So if we think at this field, actually we realize that this is quite a familiar field for almost all of us. And this is because science fiction movies have provided several examples of these technologies. Probably the most classic and popular one is from the original Star Wars movie series, when Luke Skywalker, as you would remember, lost his hand in one of his fights. And this is the way in which the technology available in his universe and world could manage to do. So as you can see, this is quite an advanced substitution of human limbs with a robotic limb. And actually, we are very far from that level. This is still science fiction. But with respect to the time in which the movie was filmed, now we are getting closer and closer to this reality. And indeed, to go from now science fiction to real world, what you will see in this video is some snapshot from the Cybertron, which now is reality. It's not science fiction anymore. These are real patients. And this happened very recently, just last year. And it was the first Olympics on bionics. So in these Olympic Games, patients wearing advanced technologies that interface with their nervous system, so with their brain, spinal cord, and other parts of the neuromuscular system. These patients competed in an Olympic style of games with these technologies. So you can see that we are still not at the level of Star Wars, but this is reality. So having said that, so having given to you an introduction to this field, I would like to show you the three questions that I will cover in this talk. So we will discuss if human limbs can be replicated with robotic parts, and that's the field of robotics and mechatronics. And then we will discuss if it is possible for the brain of humans to control limbs interface with the human body. And finally, we will discuss if in the future these robotic parts will even be better than our biological limbs. So I will try to cover these three questions. So starting with the first one, what can we do from the robotic design point of view? Well, here is an example to start with a representative case of a robotic leg mounted on a patient, and to recover locomotion in case of leg amputation. There are many of these systems for lower limbs, and this system have quite already an impressive performance in terms of the way in which they allow recovery of function in these patients. Here you can see a video from one of the companies producing this type of technology. And this is a patient wearing such prosthesis. You can see that he can walk. He can walk not only on flat surfaces, but also on uneven terrain, in slopes. He can do jumps, and so on. So this is state-of-the-art technology. Now, I would like to emphasize that in this case, the patient is not controlling this knee, this robotic knee, directly with this nervous system, but rather that the stiffness of the knee, depending on the weight that it has to support, is automatically controlled with sensors placed on the leg. So there is not a real interface with the nervous system in this case. So we can study these systems in detail. We can have models that interface mechanical parts with the human body. We can study the forces exchanged with this system, and then we can design variable stiffness joints in order to optimize locomotion. If now we consider the upper limb is a bit more complicated because our arms and hands allow very complex tasks. So substituting a full arm and hand is a bit more complex. The complexity mainly comes from the need to substitute a very, very nice of biological engineering work, which is the human hand. The human hand is a very sophisticated device. It allows to perform a very delicate movement, at the same time strong forces, a feat of manipulation abilities, and indeed, in order to do that, it is controlled by our brain in a very complex way. So can we substitute such a complex biological device? Well, again, if we look at the robotic substitution, we can design robotic hands. We can mimic the anatomy of the human hand. These are examples of robotic hands used to substitute lost hands in patients. And as you can see, the robotic counterparts replicate the anatomy in a relatively good way. Actually, if we look at the state-of-the-art in robotics, in particular in robotic hands, we can perform very advanced tasks with robotic hands. Here you can see a robotic arm and hand that is making an extremely sophisticated task, very delicate, touching on those glasses, producing noise without breaking the glasses, with very, very high precision. So that's what we have from the robotic developments is very impressive. But now, be careful at a detail in this video. In this video, this robotic arm and hand is completely autonomously controlled, meaning that there is not a brain of a patient controlling it. It's pre-programmed to do that task. We are not connecting that with the human body. So we are able to perform a very advanced control, but in this case, we have a pure robot. We don't have a human-robot interaction. So what happens when we interface this arm with a human? Well, this is an example of what happens. This is research from Brown University in the US, a patient who has a high-level impairment has a chip implanted in her brain. And now the robotic arm that you can see here is very similar to the one that you have just seen in the previous video, the one that was touching the glasses. But now it is controlled by the brain of the patient. Now you can see that what the patient can do is, of course, remarkable, but you can see the difference with respect to what the robot could do in the previous video. So what is the difficulty? Well, the difficulty is actually the bottleneck in this field of research. The difficulty is to establish a link between the nervous system of this patient in order to control this robotic arm, exploiting the full potential of that robotic arm. That is very, very difficult. And this actually leads us to the second question. The second question is, can the human brain control robotic limbs? So can we actually perform that interfacing that you have just see as a glimpse in the last video? So let's face this question. Let's see what is actually possible to do at the moment. So in order to do that, as I anticipated, we have to connect with the nervous system. And we will take the example of arms, so upper limbs, because this is the most complex limb to connect with the brain, especially because of the high functionality of the human hand and to reproduce that functionality. So we'll take this as an example. So how can we connect the nervous system of a human with a robotic device like that one? Well, we can do that at various levels of the neuromuscular system of a patient. We can implant electrodes into the brain, as you have seen in the video of the lady controlling the robotic arm. That is a direct brain interface. We can also proceed more peripherally. We can implant electrodes in the spinal cord. Or, still more peripherally, we can interface, so connect electrodes with peripheral nerves. And last, we could also use the muscle tissue, the remaining muscle tissue. So in patients with amputations, we can use the muscle tissue above the amputation, and this muscle tissue is actually directly connected by the nerves to the spinal cord and eventually to the brain. So also that is a sort of a bioscreen for understanding the neural activity and the movement intention of the patient to be translated into control of a robotic limb. So currently, patients who have robotic limbs and they use them in their daily activities base their control of an interfacing that is at the peripheral level. There are technologies being developed by us and by others also at the brain level, but these are still very much into the experimentation phase. They're still not available to patients, or at least not to a large number of patients. So I will focus actually on a more peripheral interfacing to show you real patients and what they can do with this technology. So on the market, the simplest systems of this type, and these are systems that are used by several thousands of patients. So this is a system that are already available to patients, operate in a rather simple way. They are, to substitute the human hand, gripper of this type, basically open and close, so they allow to grasp objects, and they are controlled by electrical signals recorded from muscles above the amputation. So the type of control is actually very simple. Imagine to have two muscles above the amputation from which we can put on which we can put electrodes, recording their electrical activity, which depends on the electrical activity ultimately from the brain of the patients down to the spinal cord and then to the muscle. So the electrical activity produced by the patient from one of these two muscles is used, for example, to open the end, and the other one to close the end. So the patients can control these two muscles with this brain and open and close. Very simple interface. This is what a patient can do using this type of system. You can see a prosthetics, a robotic hand on the left-hand side, and you can see a patient in a simulated activity of daily living, in a kitchen in this case, using that limb controlled by his intent, by his volitional control, in order to do some basic task. You have seen that the tasks that he does, are, at least with the prosthetic hand, are not very advanced, because the interface is very simple. But still, these systems work on a clinical basis in a very robust way. So a very large number of patients use systems like this. Now, if you think of this concept of using the muscles for interface, then the higher is the level of the amputation, the more difficult is to make this interface, because we have less and less muscles that are available to put electrodes in. So what if we have to substitute an entire arm? Well, one possibility is still to use the concept of a muscle interface, but with a surgical intervention. So consider this schematic representation of a patient who have lost an entire arm. So this is the shoulder. Now, the nerves that are controlling this arm would be present at the stump level, and they are cut, of course. Those are the nerves that would go to the arm in order to control all the complex movements of the arm and the end. So there is a surgical intervention that was one of the breakthroughs in prosthetics, invented in Chicago, actually proposed in Chicago for the first time by Professor Kaiken, for which the nerves that are at the stump level are surgically redirected into other muscles, not the muscles of the arm that is missing, but, for example, the pectoralis muscle or back muscles. Why do we do that? Well, because when the nerves are reaching the muscle, the target muscles, they will start producing electrical activity in these muscles. And that electrical activity would correspond to the activity of the nerves that previously were controlling the arm. So by decoding the electrical activity produced at this level, is like decoding the activity of each of these nerves. So theoretically, it's like understanding how the central nervous system sends the signals to the peripheral nerves to control the missing arm. Very interesting procedure, because now we use these muscles as sort of bioscreens of nerve activity. I will show you a video in a second. And of course, then we can interface these muscles with an interface that actually is a neural interface, meaning that we are decoding the nerve activity. So what we will see here is a real patient who underwent this kind of surgery. And the color map that you see are the electrical activity that we can record from the muscles that have been reinnervated when the patient does this task of his missing limb. Now, those color maps are really bioscreens. They tell us how each of the nerves that was producing those movements of the missing limb, what that nerve is doing. And by decoding this activity, so by collecting that activity and associating that activity to each nerve, we can then control a full robotic arm that replicates what the missing arm would do, exactly following the intention of the patient. So in a very natural and intuitive way. So here you can see one of these patients. This is quite an old video. It's one of the original videos from Chicago where this surgical procedure was proposed. So this is a patient with quite an extreme injury, as you can see. It's a bilateral amputation of both arms, quite high. So basically the full arms are missing. And the two arms have been substituted with robotic arms. And this patient has underwent that surgical procedure that I just explained to you, and then it was interfaced in order to decode the activity of the nerves controlling that arm. And as you can see, as you have seen in these videos, the patient is recovering the ability to control that arm. Of course, it's not like a natural arm, as you can see. I mean, it's not what healthy individuals would do, but it's definitely better than no arms at all. It's quite a robust interface. So how do we pick these signals? So once we have redirected nerves and we can use muscles as bioscreens, well, here is an example of an amputation at the humeral level, and these are another patients in which this nerve redirection procedure has been implemented. And then in this patient, we implanted small capsules that record the electrical signals produced by those nerves in the reinnervated muscles. So you can see in this radiography these small capsules that are implanted exactly in the points where we have the reinnervation, where the nerve activity is connecting to the muscles. And then these small capsules transmit that electrical signal through an antenna to the external device to control a robotic limb. So this is state of the art. It's still not this technology available to all patients, but is what is possible to do in academic environments. And after we have done that, as I said, we have then to map those electrical signals into movement. You remember at the very beginning I showed you those two pictures of the neural cells and the complex movements we perform. Now this is exactly what we need to do. Now we have an interface, we have an attachment to the neural information, and then we have to understand how the neural information produces movement in order to replicate movement. And we do that with advanced mathematics, with processing of these electrical signals. This is not a patient, he's an healthy individual. He has electrodes on his arms, and here what we are testing is how we can interpret those electrical signals in terms of control of a robotic hand. You see that the robotic hand, or you have seen a minute ago, reproduce the movement of that patient. So what we are doing in that case is to use the electrical activity in order to predict the movement and to replicate the movement in this robotic device. If we can do that, then we have a mapping. We have a mapping between neural activation that give us the intention of the patient and the actual movement that that patient wants to do. And that's basically all. Then we can close the loop and have a proper interface, a limb mounted on a patient, and a patient controlling it in a natural way. Now, with all this technology put together, this is somehow the best, or among the best things we can do on patients of this type. These are our own laboratories. So you see that this is a prototype. So it's not a complete clinical socket, but doesn't matter, it's in the laboratory. But in this case, we are recording signals in the ways that I explained to you before. We do the mapping, as I have mentioned, and the patient controls this robotic hand attached to his arm in a natural way, in an intuitive way. And you can see that he is able to perform also quite dexterous and delicate movements. Again, it's not like a natural hand, but it's quite an advanced type of interfacing. In this video, you see the same patient, and I show this video also to demonstrate to you the type of clinical test that we do in order to understand how this technology works for patients. So this is a board, a standardized board, on which the patient works by moving objects in a standardized way. So he's presented with different objects, moving objects from one part to another. You see, for example, this is taking a coin from a table, which is not a simple task, but he can do that. And we do this clinical test for, in principle, several hours, and then we record in a precise way how the patient does every single of the tasks that we presented to him. And then we produce a clinical score to understand if the technology that we have produced has a real good impact on the recovery of functionality of that patient. Now, it's very important that the patient is in a natural control of the robotic limb, not only because it can recover function, but also because when we talk about interfacing robotic parts with humans, we need to make it in a way that the robotic part feels as a part of the body scheme of the patient. So that should be part of his body. It should not be a tool like a screwdriver. And in that respect, the better is the control for the patient, the more intuitive and natural is the control, the more that piece of robotics will feel as a part of his body. So this patient in particular had a short interview that we did after that test, and you see that he's quite happy about that. But especially, you have seen in one of the sentences that he mentioned, he was stating, "This is my hand." That's the important part. We are not talking about a tool that we give to the patient, as I say, like an hammer or a screwdriver, with which he can perform some task better. We are giving him a body part, and it has to be felt as a body part. All right, so this is one of our patients and friend who is exactly explaining this principle of feeling that robotic hand as his body part. In this case, is in a German fair, a bit similar to this event, but in Germany some years ago. All right, so we are able to do to perform quite an advanced replica of human function with these systems. Still, we are very far from the science fiction dream that I have reported and drawn in this ideal scenario, in which, in this case, a musician is playing with two robotic hands a piano in a natural way with an accuracy and a dexterity equal or superior than human hands. We're very far from that. So how can we fill the gap between what we can do now and a control that is closer to natural hands? There are many different directions in research, and we don't have time to cover them all. It would also be boring in some respects. But I will give you an example of one of the research lines in order to maybe reach this dream. And one of the research lines is to add more intelligence into this robotic system, in addition to the brain of the patient. So we can make use of a lot of smart technology nowadays. So we can, for example, put video cameras in smart glasses, and then this video camera will look at the environment, for example, a table, and with computer vision and computer algorithms, the microprocessor inside that can study the environment, can be a sort of a second brain in addition to the one of the patient, and can help the patient doing tasks that may be too difficult for him to do with a direct control from his brain. So basically now we have two brains. One is an artificial brain that studies the environment, and the other one is the user brain. We can make them working together in order to perform very complex tasks in an easier way for the patient with respect to using only his brain with this type of interface. And I will show you an example of this. This is a patient wearing sort of Google glasses, for those of you who know them. So they are glasses that have a camera that can process videos of the environment. And in this case, what I call the second brain, so the processing that goes in parallel with the process of the user brain, is doing this kind of analysis. So he looks at the objects on the table, he makes models of the objects, he understands, for example, that in front of the patient there is a cylinder, he makes a model of that cylinder, and what does he do eventually? Well, if we recognize an object that is particularly difficult to grasp, that second brain, artificial brain, controls the hand autonomously. It makes the hand making the task to grasp that specific object. The user then only does the high-level control, only says, I want to grasp that object. It doesn't say, I want to flex the index finger of a certain amount and the other fingers of the other amount. It doesn't do all that. It just tells to the system, I want to grasp that object. The artificial intelligence recognizes the object and controls the hand to grasp that object. So if you remember the initial video of the robotic hand touching the glasses, that was a purely robotic control. There were no humans. Then in the examples I provided you just before this one, we had only the human who was trying to control this robotic system. Now this is a sort of putting the two things together. We have a semi-autonomous control. We have a robotic control which is autonomous, and we still have the patient in the loop. Patients do not like to feel like robots, of course. They need to be in control. But of course, if we can aid them in doing tasks better, that support is felt positively. So this is just an example of the research direction in order to further the control of these limbs. And this leads us to the last question. So we've just discussed the opportunity to push research in order to have better and better control of these robotic limbs. And we have said that we are not yet at the level of reproducing a biological limb in a control as natural as it would be for our natural limbs, but still we can look at the future. And we can ask ourselves, well, will eventually bionic limbs be even better than biological ones? After all, we can do robotic hands that are stronger, faster, more accurate than biological hands. That we can do. It's difficult then to connect them, as we have discussed, with the brain. But will there be a time in which we can do that? Well, first, with this interfacing, we can control, in principle, any kind of limb, also different from the natural limb. So this is an healthy individual who is somehow playing with this robotic arm. So there is an interface to his neuromuscular system similar to the one that I explained to you. So similar to the one that we use for patients. And with this interface, he's controlling remotely this robotic arm that is very different anatomically from our arms. It has more joints, for example. But despite the fact that this robotic arm has more joints, that individual can control it with his brain, with the interface that I have indicated to you. So this is just to tell you that in principle there are no limits. Once we advance this interfacing, we can control super limbs, any kind of limbs, in principle. So will we arrive at the level in which we really can do that in a superior way? I will show you an example, which is an example on patient in which a special group of patients actually decided to substitute their limbs with robotic limbs. And I will explain you why. So none of us would do that because we have perfectly working limbs. But there are specific patients who, despite they have hands and arms anatomically present, they have difficulties in controlling them. And among this type of patients are patients following that underwent an injury of the brachial plexus. So the brachial plexus is the set of nerves at the shoulder level that innervates the full arm. They can be damaged. They can be damaged in some type of accidents. A classic accident for these injuries, unfortunately, is motorbike accidents. There are injuries at the shoulder, the nerves innervating the arm are damaged, and this is called a sort of internal amputation. Internal amputation because the limb is present, but the nerves that are connecting the brain to the limb are cut. So the patient have the impossibility to control their hand. And sometimes, so there are some surgical solutions in some cases at the nerve level, but in many cases it's very difficult to recover the hand function. And these patients remain in this situation for their entire life. For example, in this case, this patient at the time of the video was for about 15 years in this condition. Now, this is not an healthy limb, but still it's a perfectly intact anatomical limb. So that's why I want to provide you as an example. So time ago, around 5-6 years ago, a professor in Vienna, Professor Atzmann, who is a very good friend of mine, had a number of these patients knocking at his door and asking him what they can do, because this is a very impairing condition. And he didn't know what to answer. He's a surgeon. He's one of the best in the world for surgery of the upper limb and neurosurgery, but he didn't have solutions. And so he thought, well, I mean, there are really no biological type of interventions that can resolve this issue. And so he discussed in a symposium held in Vienna in 2010, he discussed a very brave proposal. He discussed the possibility of cutting that hand, the non-functioning hand. So removing that hand, despite the hand is present, and substituting it with a robotic hand. Now, this is ethically very complex decision to make, because cutting a body part is an irreversible decision. And so there was an interesting symposium that included people with very different backgrounds discussing on this potential solution and intervention on these patients, and also to have the ethical approval for doing this intervention, of course, pending the agreement of the patients who were also asked. So the proposal was this one. The proposal was to start from an intact hand and to transform it in a robotic hand, removing the end, the biological end, substituting with a robotic hand. Well, at the end, a number of patients agreed on this intervention. The symposium that was gathered with people from different backgrounds thought that this was an ethically reasonable and justified thing to do, and this was done. So this was done, meaning that from this situation, the hand was amputated and substituted with a robotic hand with a very advanced interface with the neuromuscular system of the patient, basically with the techniques that I explained to you before. So redirection of the remaining nerves into some muscles in order to use them as bioscreens, complex mapping. And the concept is that the remaining nerve structures were not providing sufficient activity for natural muscles to move that hand, but that activity was sufficient to control the engines of a robotic hand. Because a robotic hand, as long as we give information, can produce any force that we want. All right? So that's the idea. Now, what you will see here is in the clinical test that you've seen before, how this patient could perform before this intervention. And what you will see here is how he performs the same task after he had that substitution. I mean, it's a robotic part. It's not like a natural hand, but with respect to what that patient could do with this hand, we have a massive improvement in situation. This is what is important. So now, as I said at the beginning, this is not a completely healthy hand, because actually it's an hand that we cannot control. But this example gives you the idea that we are really crossing the border. We are crossing the border potentially on, in the future, having this type of intervention, not for patients who cannot move the hand, but maybe for people who want to have a better hand. So that's, of course, will open quite a bit of bioethical problems. For example, who decides who gets a better hand and why? All right, so these are other videos for these patients. So these are the patients who had their hand substituted with a robotic hand. You can see they would never be able to do something like that with their own hand. They are very happy patients now. We had a clinical trial. Our laboratory was involved in this clinical trial. We had 3 patients. They are very, very happy. There are many more now. So in the data that in the video that I've shown you, there were the first 3, and this was published at a large resonance. Now there are many, many more who are asking to have this type of intervention with that kind of neurological impairment. And this is, again, the same patient doing a delicate task with that robotic hand. All right, so the media coverage, as I said, was quite substantial, because this is something that resonates. And of course, the word cyborg is a very fancy and an interesting word. But actually, we are talking about cybernetics. We are talking about integrating robotic part into the body scheme. So, should we go ahead in that direction? Well, where we will arrive? Well, as I said, and these are all open questions, once we will be able to really substitute, and if we will be able to really substitute limbs with better robotic parts, then a number of questions that are more within the field of ethics and bioethics, in this case, will open, and that will be a very, somehow also interesting point in science when discussing how to answer these questions. I don't have the answer now, of course, because we are not at the point in which we can ask ourselves those questions. But we have to think in the perspective when we will potentially have to answer those questions. All right, so basically to summarize, I have covered 3 main questions. And to be honest, I didn't give you the full answers to all of these questions. Many aspects are open, and that's because the field is an open field. But to summarize, we have seen at the beginning that the robotic technology can replicate, can mimic biological limbs, legs, arms, hands. We can do that accurately. In the second part of the talk, I have provided you one of the most important messages in this field, and that the difficulty is really the interface. The difficulty is once we replicate with a robotic technology a limb, we need to put the patient or the user in the possibility of controlling that limb in a natural way. That is very difficult. It's the most difficult thing to do. And at the end, I have touched the question, which is more for the future, if eventually we will be able to do this substitution of robotic parts in an even better way. Of course, at the moment, we are doing that for clinical reasons, for patients who need that. But I've shown you, I think, quite a provocative example of patients who didn't need necessarily the substitution of the limb, but decided to have the limb substituted despite the limb is present. Of course, in a very particular neurological situation, which is very specific. And with this, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope this has stimulated some interest and some questions. Thank you. Thank you very much. I have been instructed that there are no questions now, but those of you who are interested in posing questions, we can move in the room exactly in front of us. I will be there answering questions on this talk. Thank you again.